Big Shaq was just grabbing a drink when he heard a racist cop mock a black firefighter. Didn't know criminals wore uniforms. The gas station went silent. Customers froze. Phones quietly recorded. But Shaq didn't yell. He smiled, knowing he was about to teach this officer a lesson he'd never forget. What Shaq did next destroyed the cop's career, shook an entire police department, and changed everything. Keep watching, because this is one story you'll never forget. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Jamal Harris wiped the sweat from his brow, his uniform still heavy with the stench of smoke. The fire had been brutal, one of those blazes that left entire blocks unrecognizable. His muscles ached, his throat was raw from inhaling ash, and all he wanted was a cold drink before heading home. He stepped into the gas station, the fluorescent lights casting an almost sterile glow over the aisles. As he reached for a water bottle from the cooler, a voice cut through the quiet hum of the store. Didn't know they let criminals dress like firefighters now. Jamal froze, fingers tightening around the bottle. He exhaled slowly before turning. Standing near the register was a uniformed officer, his badge glinting under the overhead lights. Officer Daniels. Jamal had seen him around before, always carrying himself with that smug air of entitlement. Arms crossed, Daniels leaned against the counter, his smirk widening as he sized Jamal up. Most firefighters are trustworthy, Daniels added, tilting his head like he was letting Jamal in on some private joke. The words hung in the air. Jamal had been here before. Not in this exact store, not with this exact cop, but in this moment, where his uniform wasn't enough, where his years of service, the lives he had saved, the danger he had faced, it all meant nothing to someone like Daniels. The cashier shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between them. A couple of customers by the snack aisle exchanged uneasy glances, but stayed silent. No one wanted to get involved. Jamal took a measured breath. "You got something to say, officer?" Daniel shrugged. "Just making an observation. Never know these days. People sneak their way into all kinds of jobs." Jamal clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew how this went. If he snapped, if he so much as raised his voice, Daniels would have him in cuffs before he could explain himself. He took a step forward, leveling his gaze at the officer. "That's so." Daniels held his smirk, but something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected Jamal to push back. "Relax," Daniels said, feigning innocence. "It's just conversation." The tension thickened, pressing down on the room like a storm about to break. Jamal could feel the weight of every stare, every unspoken word from the silent onlookers. Then a deep voice rumbled from behind them. "You sure you want to finish that sentence?" The air in the gas station shifted. Jamal saw Daniel's smirk falter, just for a second. Slowly, Jamal turned, and when he saw the towering figure behind him, he couldn't help the small smirk that tugged at the corner of his own lips. Shaquille O'Neal stood there, arms crossed, his presence alone making the room feel smaller. Daniel swallowed, trying to mask his sudden unease. The silence stretched. Shaq tilted his head, his voice calm but firm. "Go ahead, man. Say what you were about to say." The store was dead silent. Jamal watched as Daniel shifted on his feet, suddenly unsure of himself. The officer had been so confident a moment ago, but now he looked like a man who realized he had just made a very big mistake. The gas station felt smaller. Shaquille O'Neal stepped forward, his towering 7 feet 1 inch frame casting a shadow over Officer Daniels. The air in the room shifted. People who had been pretending not to watch were now fully locked in, eyes darting between the massive NBA legend and the smirking cop. Daniels blinked. He hadn't seen Shaq walk in, hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, but he quickly recovered, straightening his shoulders and forcing out a scoff. "Oh, great. The celebrity wants to play hero." Shaq didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just stared down at Daniels with that slow, deliberate kind of intensity that made even the most arrogant men think twice. "You got a problem with firefighters?" Shaq asked, his deep voice steady, controlled. Daniels let out a short chuckle, trying to keep his bravado. "Not all of them." Jamal Harris shifted beside Shaq, his jaw tightening. He had been disrespected before, but never this publicly. Never while still wearing the uniform that had just saved lives. His hands clenched at his sides, soot still caked under his fingernails. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying Daniels like he was trying to decide if he was worth another second of his time. Then he spoke. "You sure about that?" The question wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. Daniels hesitated, barely noticeable, but enough. His smirk twitched. The cashier behind the counter swallowed hard. The man in the business suit, who had been watching like this was just another episode of reality TV, suddenly looked uneasy. Jamal could see it in Daniel's eyes. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected the usual response. A little frustration, a little anger, maybe even a weak attempt at arguing back. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the entire room turning against him. He hadn't expected Shaq. Daniels cleared his throat, glancing toward the door like he was calculating his exit. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he muttered, trying to sound casual. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Because you were real comfortable talking reckless a minute ago." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. The gas station was dead silent. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter. And then, before Daniels could say another word, a soft click cut through the stillness. A young woman near the back of the store lowered her phone. She had been recording the entire thing. The gas station had gone dead silent. Daniel's smirk twitched slightly as he shifted on his feet. The air felt heavier now, the eyes of the customers pressing on him, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Shaq remained still, arms crossed, watching him. His presence was undeniable, unshakable. He didn't need to raise his voice or throw insults. His silence alone was enough to rattle anyone. Jamal exhaled slowly, gripping the cold water bottle in his hand. His uniform was still damp with sweat, soot streaking his sleeves. He had spent hours battling a fire, risking his life to protect people he didn't even know. And now, standing in this gas station, he had to defend himself from this? Shaq's voice broke through the thick air. "Hey," he said, turning to the cashier. "You got cameras in here?" The young man behind the counter, barely out of his teens, hesitated before nodding. Yeah, we do." His voice was unsure, his gaze flicking nervously toward Daniel's. Daniels straightened his shoulders. "Why do you care?" His tone was sharp, defensive. Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question linger, watching the way the officer's fingers twitched at his sides. Then he smirked. "Because I want to make sure we catch everything." Daniels let out a dry laugh. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Jamal tilted his head slightly. "If it's so ridiculous, why are you so nervous?" Daniel's jaw tensed. "I ain't nervous." Shaq glanced at the cashier again. "Mind pulling up that footage?" The kid hesitated, looking between them like he wasn't sure what to do. Then, with a slow nod, he reached under the counter, tapping a few buttons on the small monitor. The screen flickered to life, showing a real-time feed of the store. The rewind button blinked, waiting to be pressed. Daniel shifted again. His eyes darted toward the exit. Shaq noticed. "You in a rush?" Daniel scoffed. "I got places to be." Shaq unfolded his arm, standing tall. "Nah, I think you should stick around for this." A quiet buzz filled the air. The young woman recording the whole exchange had stopped pretending to browse. Now she was fully focused, her phone aimed at Daniel's, and she wasn't the only one. Other customers had started pulling out their own phones. For the first time, Daniels wasn't the one in control. Shaq gave a small nod to the cashier. "Let's see what really happened." The cashier clicked play. Daniels exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, you think a little video's gonna change anything?" He had no idea how wrong he was. The moment Daniels scoffed, dismissing Shaq's warning like it was nothing, the young woman at the back of the store made her move. She lowered her phone slightly, smirking. "Too late, buddy. I already got it on camera." Daniel's expression twitched. "Excuse me?" Shaq turned his head slightly, arching an eyebrow. "You hear that?" Jamal, who had stayed silent through most of the exchange, finally chuckled. He took a slow sip of his water, shaking his head. "Man, you really picked the wrong day." Daniels looked at the woman, then at the growing crowd. More customers had their phones out now, some whispering, others staring in silence. The tension had shifted. This wasn't just about words anymore. This was evidence. The woman's fingers moved quickly over her phone screen. And posted. A notification popped up on her screen. Uploading to X. Done. She turned the brightness up slightly, letting the blue-lit notification hover over her smirking face. Shaq grinned. "What's it say?" She held the phone up. The caption was simple but brutal. "This cop just harassed a firefighter," and Shaq was there to see it all. Daniels took a step forward. "You need to delete that. Now." She raised an eyebrow. "Or what? You gonna arrest me for using my phone?" Daniel's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Knew better than to make another mistake on camera. Shaq leaned on the counter, looking way too relaxed for the chaos unraveling around him. "Man, you must really hate social media, huh?" Daniel's radio suddenly crackled. The loud static noise cut through the quiet room like a blade. Officer Daniels, you need to report in. Now." A flicker of real concern crossed his face. He reached for his radio, pressing it to his mouth. "This is Daniels. What's going on?" Silence. Then, "We need you back at the station. Urgently." Jamal crossed his arms. "Uh-oh. Sounds serious." Shaq nodded, smirking. "Yeah, I'd say that little video just hit its first 100,000 views." Daniels swallowed hard. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Then again, and again. He reached for it, hesitated, then yanked it out. His lock screen was flooded with notifications, group chats, missed calls, a breaking news alert. His jaw clenched. The young woman, still holding her phone up, refreshed her screen. Her eyes widened slightly. "Damn, 250,000 views already. That was fast." Daniel's hands tightened around his radio. "I'll be right there," he muttered, but deep down, he already knew this wasn't going away. Daniels took a step back, gripping his radio tighter. The smug confidence he had worn just moments ago was cracking, piece by piece. His gaze darted between Shaq, Jamal, and the growing number of onlookers still recording him. The situation had spun wildly out of his control, and for the first time, it showed. Shaq crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "What's wrong? Not so funny anymore?" Daniel shot him a glare. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. He pressed the radio closer to his mouth. "Dispatch, repeat that last transmission." The static crackled again before a stern voice responded. "Daniels, report to the station immediately. Chief wants you in his office. Now." Daniels swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed as he shifted uncomfortably. He forced out a chuckle, but it landed flat. Pfft, probably just a routine check-in. Jamal took a slow sip from his water bottle, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "Right. Just a coincidence that they called right after your little moment here went viral?" Daniels ignored him, pulling out his phone to check his notifications. His fingers twitched as he scrolled through hundreds of messages. Group chats with his fellow officers were blowing up. Some were panicked, others were furious. "Bro, what did you do? You're all over the news, man. You might want to lawyer up." A fresh headline flashed across his screen. "Racist cop harasses firefighter. Shaq puts him in his place." The video was already on news sites, Twitter, and even a few verified celebrity accounts. It had hit 1 million views in under an hour. Daniels felt his stomach twist. The laughter and arrogance drained from his face. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He needed to get ahead of this, fast. Taking a sharp breath, he squared his shoulders and turned toward the exit. "I don't have time for this. I've got real work to do." Shaq's deep chuckle made him freeze mid-step. "Oh, you got real work to do?" Shaq said, raising an eyebrow. "Like what? Filing paperwork on why you just went viral?" The gas station erupted into quiet laughter. A few customers covered their mouths, trying to stifle their amusement. Even the cashier smirked. Daniels turned a deep shade of red. "This is all being blown out of proportion." Jamal leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "Nah, man. This is exactly the right proportion." Daniels opened his mouth to fire back, but his radio crackled one last time. "Daniels, where the hell are you? Get in here or don't bother coming back at all." A cold sweat broke out on Daniels' forehead. Shaq nodded toward Jamal. "Hey, man, you ever seen a guy ruin his own career in under 5 minutes?" Jamal grinned. "Just did." Daniels stormed out, his fists clenched. But he wasn't just heading to the station. He was heading straight into disaster. The internet was already devouring Daniels alive. He just didn't know it yet. As Daniels stepped outside the gas station, his radio crackling with urgent demands from his precinct, he casually glanced down at his phone. At first, he saw a couple notifications, then another and another. His brow furrowed, his curiosity quickly shifting into dread. Inside his patrol car, Daniel's phone vibrated relentlessly. He picked it up, seeing dozens of missed calls, unread texts, and notifications from social media platforms he barely used. He hesitated, tapping on a notification from a local news app. The headline exploded onto his screen like a grenade. "Racist cop harasses firefighter. Shaq witnesses everything." Daniel's stomach tightened painfully. He quickly opened the article. His heart raced as he read through lines that painted him as a villain, a dangerous, arrogant cop who thought he was above the law. The story detailed the exchange he'd had with Jamal Harris, capturing every word he'd carelessly tossed around, every smug expression he'd let slip. He scrolled further down, his hands trembling as he noticed the embedded video. His thumb hovered, then pressed play. His own face stared back at him, the arrogance unmistakable, his voice echoing harshly through the gas station. "Didn't know they let criminals dress like firefighters now." Daniels cringed. He saw himself smirk, saw Jamal's weary, humiliated expression, and worst of all, he watched Shaq step into the frame, calmly and powerfully confronting him. Daniels hadn't realized how small, how utterly pathetic he looked in Shaq's shadow. He quickly exited the video, his breath coming in short gasps now. Daniels checked the comments. They were ruthless, angry, and relentless. Disgusting. He doesn't deserve that badge. How many other people has this guy harassed? He should be fired immediately. Shaq just became my hero all over again. Daniels threw the phone onto the passenger seat, panic gripping him tightly. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles turning white as he stared blankly through the windshield. His radio crackled again, more aggressively this time. Officer Daniels, report immediately to precinct. Chief demands to see you now. He started the engine, hands slick with sweat. As he pulled onto the road, the reality of his situation began sinking in. His career, his reputation, everything he'd spent years building was collapsing before his eyes. Across town, Shaq's phone was also exploding. But unlike Daniels, he was calm. Celebrities, activists, and friends were texting their support, asking how they could help. Shaq smiled faintly, glancing at Jamal, who sat next to him, still shaken, but clearly moved by the overwhelming wave of solidarity. You okay? Shaq asked, gently clapping a hand on Jamal's shoulder. Jamal took a deep breath, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yeah, just never thought I'd see something like this actually change anything. Shaq nodded solemnly. This isn't just about today. It's about every time someone like Daniels abuses their power. People saw the truth. They're ready for change. Meanwhile, Daniels sped through the city streets, his heart pounding. His mind raced frantically, replaying the moment in the gas station over and over again, desperately searching for an excuse or an escape route. But there was none. His phone buzzed again. Unable to resist, he glanced at it again. Another headline flashed up. Officer Daniels' record under investigation. Multiple allegations of racial profiling surface. He nearly swerved off the road, his vision blurry with panic. Daniels slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration. He hadn't expected any of this. He'd gotten away with similar things before, confident his badge would always protect him. But today was different. Today he had crossed paths with someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Someone with power, influence, and integrity. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just another bystander. Daniels finally understood, bitterly and belatedly, that he'd just challenged a force bigger than himself. As Daniels pulled into the precinct parking lot, reporters and cameras swarmed him instantly. Flashbulbs exploded in his eyes, microphones thrust aggressively toward his face. Officer Daniels, how long have you harassed innocent citizens? Do you have anything to say about the video? Do you plan to resign? He pushed through the crowd, eyes wide with fear and anger. Just as he reached the precinct's entrance, his phone vibrated again. Unable to stop himself, he checked the message. It was from his captain. Internal Affairs is here. Bring your badge and gun. Immediately. His hands shook violently as he stared at the message. Daniels knew there was no turning back now. His life had officially imploded, and Shaq had been right. Daniels had ruined his entire career in under 5 minutes. Daniels was spiraling out of control, and Shaq was determined to make sure he'd never get that control back. In the backseat of his SUV, Shaq dialed a direct line. The call connected instantly. Mayor Thompson speaking? A voice answered, professional yet warm. Shaq didn't waste time. Mayor Thompson, it's Shaquille. Listen, we've got a problem. There was a brief pause, the mayor's voice quickly shifting from casual to concerned. Talk to me. Is this about that video blowing up online? Shaq leaned forward, watching Jamal in the rearview mirror, as the firefighter stared quietly out the window, his face a mask of mixed exhaustion and disbelief. Yeah, it's about the video, Shaq replied. But it's more than that. This officer, Daniels, he's out of control. He can't hide behind his badge anymore. The mayor sighed heavily. Believe me, Shaq, I saw it. It's disgraceful. We'll investigate thoroughly. With all due respect, Shaq cut in firmly, an investigation isn't enough. People are watching, especially the ones who've lived this reality for far too long. They want real change, not just promises. The mayor paused again, clearly absorbing the gravity of Shaq's words. Understood, he finally said. Give me an hour. Shaq hung up, breathing deeply. He knew how slowly the wheels of justice typically turned, especially when confronting someone protected by a badge. But this time felt different. This time, the whole world was watching. Back at the precinct, Daniels burst through the front doors, nearly slamming them off their hinges. All heads turned sharply towards him, eyes filled with a mixture of shock, pity, and quiet judgment. Daniels strode toward the chief's office, heart racing, breath ragged. Every step echoed in his ears like the drumbeat of a funeral march. As Daniels entered, Chief Barrett was standing by the window, back turned, clearly trying to contain his anger. "Sit down," Barrett said coldly, not even bothering to look at Daniels. Daniels hesitated, then sank into the chair, sweating under his uniform. "Chief, it was just—" Barrett spun around, eyes blazing. "Just what, Daniels? Just a joke? Just a misunderstanding? You publicly humiliated a man who risks his life for people like you every day." Daniels swallowed hard. I can explain." Barrett slammed his hand onto the desk, rattling papers and nearly knocking over a coffee mug. "I've already heard your excuses too many times. This ends today." Daniels felt a lump form in his throat. "Chief, please. I've served this department." "No!" Barrett interrupted sharply. "You've disgraced this department. Internal Affairs will handle you now." Daniels' eyes widened in disbelief. His stomach churned as Barrett turned away again, signaling the conversation was over. Daniels stood up shakily, pride shattered, dignity stripped away. He stumbled toward the door, feeling his world collapsing with every painful step. Outside, Daniels was met by an unexpected swarm of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones jabbed forward. A reporter shouted, "Officer Daniels, how does it feel to be suspended? Do you regret your actions?" Daniels shielded his eyes, anger bubbling up, but he had no words. He shoved through the crowd, breathing fast, desperate to escape. As he reached his patrol car, his phone buzzed again. A single message from an unknown number. "You can't hide behind that badge anymore." Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A terrifying realization gripped him. His shield, his authority, the thin blue line he had hidden behind his whole career. None of it could protect him now. This wasn't Daniel's first offense. Not by a long shot. And now his dark past was finally catching up to him. At the local news station, reporters crowded around screens, uncovering a trail of misconduct buried beneath years of paperwork. Headlines flashed urgently across the newsroom monitors. "Officer Daniels exposed, a history of racial profiling." Daniels paced anxiously in his small apartment, his heart pounding violently as he watched the evening news. He felt the walls closing in around him as a stern-faced anchor announced, "Multiple complaints of discrimination have surfaced against Officer Daniels," stretching back nearly a decade. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the remote. "No," Daniels whispered, eyes wide with panic. "This can't be happening." But it was. On screen, one by one, victims stepped forward. A young black man recounted being pulled over 3 times in a single month for nothing more than looking suspicious. An elderly woman tearfully described Daniels humiliating her grandson outside their own home. Each story twisted deeper into Daniels' chest, suffocating him with every painful detail. Across town, Shaq watched the same broadcast, seated calmly next to Jamal at the fire station. Jamal shook his head slowly, disbelief mixed with a quiet rage simmering just below the surface. 10 years, Jamal muttered bitterly. "He got away with this for 10 years? Shaq leaned forward, eyes fixed intently on the screen. "Not anymore. It's finally catching up to him." Meanwhile, Daniel's phone buzzed incessantly, an avalanche of messages flooding in. Colleagues, journalists, even distant relatives. He ignored them all, staring numbly at the television. His pulse raced as his own face flashed onto the screen again. An old photo, smiling in uniform, twisted now into something monstrous. His breathing quickened, chest tightening. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space, knocking over empty bottles in his path. "They're destroying me," he muttered, panic seeping into his voice. "This isn't fair. They're lying." His mind raced, searching for an escape, a loophole, anything. He dialed a number frantically, calling his partner, Officer Mitchell. The line rang endlessly, unanswered. He threw the phone onto the couch, desperation setting in. Suddenly, pounding erupted at his front door. Daniels froze, heart slamming against his ribs. He slowly approached, peering through the peephole. Suddenly, pounding erupted at his front door. Daniels froze, heart slamming against his ribs. He slowly approached, peering through the peephole, terrified of what he'd find. Outside, a swarm of journalists stood with cameras, microphones, and blinding lights aimed straight at his door. "Officer Daniels," one shouted, voice muffled through the wood. "Do you deny these allegations? Are you willing to apologize?" Daniels stepped back sharply, the room spinning around him. "Go away!" he shouted, voice cracking with desperation. "Leave me alone!" But the voices grew louder, relentless. He sank down against the wall, head in his hands, shaking uncontrollably. His world was unraveling, every thread of his carefully maintained facade coming undone. Back at the fire station, Jamal stood quietly, fists clenched tightly. "This is justice," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "It's late, but it's finally happening." Shaq nodded gravely, placing a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "And we're just getting started." The TV screen shifted again, showing Daniel's home surrounded by reporters. The anchor's voice echoed grimly. "As of now, Officer Daniels remains silent, but his silence may not protect him for long." Daniels stared numbly at his own front door, dread flooding his veins. He reached desperately for the remote, trying to shut it off, trying to block it all out, but his trembling fingers wouldn't obey. His face remained plastered on every channel, inescapable. "This can't be real," he whispered weakly, voice barely audible over the pounding at the door. But the harsh truth was staring him in the face. His reputation, his career, his entire life were collapsing live on national television. Daniels had nowhere left to hide. He was trapped, exposed, and everyone knew exactly who he was. Daniels had always believed that his badge was unbreakable, a shield strong enough to protect him from any consequence. But today, standing in front of the precinct captain, surrounded by stony-faced colleagues, he realized how wrong he'd been. "Effective immediately," Captain Reynolds announced coldly, "Officer Daniels is suspended without pay, pending a full investigation." Daniels' jaw dropped in shock, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Wait, Captain, this is all blown out of proportion. I was just joking around." "Joking?" Reynolds shot back, his voice icy, echoing harshly through the packed precinct. "You think discrimination is a joke? You embarrass this department, Daniels. Public trust is broken." Daniels glanced desperately around the room, searching for allies among the colleagues he'd once considered friends. But each officer avoided his eyes, faces tense, turning away. His badge, once a symbol of respect, felt unbearably heavy pinned to his chest. He slammed his fist on the captain's desk, desperation cracking his voice. "Captain, I've given 10 years to this department. You can't just toss me aside." Captain Reynolds leaned forward, eyes narrowed into sharp slits. 10 years. That's exactly the problem. 10 years of complaints swept under the rug. It stops now. Turn in your badge and your weapon. The silence was deafening. Slowly, Daniels unpinned his badge, hands shaking as he placed it on the desk. His weapon followed, the dull thud against the wood echoing like a gavel, sealing his fate. Across town, Jamal stood backstage at a popular local news station, heart racing as he adjusted his firefighter uniform. Bright lights flooded the stage ahead, and the faint buzz of audience chatter filled the air. He wasn't used to the spotlight, but tonight, he knew it mattered. "You're on in 2, a producer whispered, giving him an encouraging nod. Jamal exhaled deeply, steeling himself for the moment ahead. He stepped onto the stage, met with thunderous applause. But as he settled into the guest chair, his gaze locked onto a familiar face already seated on stage. Shaq, towering even while sitting down, smiling reassuringly. "Jamal," the host began warmly, "tell us what went through your mind during this shocking incident." Jamal hesitated for only a brief moment, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, anger, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever faced that kind of disrespect. I was tired, exhausted from saving lives, and in a single moment, someone tried to strip all that away." The crowd murmured in support, clearly moved. The host turned toward Shaq, eyes bright with curiosity. "Shaq, you witnessed everything. What's your perspective on Officer Daniels' behavior?" Shaq leaned forward, eyes serious, his deep voice resonating through the studio. "People like Daniels, they hide behind power, behind authority. They think they're untouchable, but guess what? They're not." Cheers erupted, the audience energized by Shaq's words. Daniels, meanwhile, sat alone in his dim apartment, watching the interview unfold on his TV screen. His fists clenched, anger and despair mixing dangerously within him. "Officer Daniels is suspended without pay, pending a full investigation." Daniels' jaw dropped in shock, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Wait, Captain, this is all blown out of proportion. I was just joking around." "Joking?" Reynolds shot back, his voice icy, echoing harshly through the packed precinct. "You think discrimination is a joke? You embarrass this department, Daniels. Public trust is broken." Daniels glanced desperately around the room, searching for allies among the colleagues he'd once considered friends. But each officer avoided his eyes, faces tense, turning away. His badge, once a symbol of respect, felt unbearably heavy pinned to his chest. He slammed his fist on the captain's desk, desperation cracking his voice. "Captain, I've given 10 years to this department. You can't just toss me aside." Captain Reynolds leaned forward, eyes narrowed into sharp slits. 10 years. That's exactly the problem. 10 years of complaints swept under the rug. It stops now. Turn in your badge and your weapon. The silence was deafening. Slowly, Daniels unpinned his badge, hands shaking as he placed it on the desk. His weapon followed, the dull thud against the wood echoing like a gavel, sealing his fate. Across town, Jamal stood backstage at a popular local news station, heart racing as he adjusted his firefighter uniform. Bright lights flooded the stage ahead, and the faint buzz of audience chatter filled the air. He wasn't used to the spotlight, but tonight, he knew it mattered. "You're on in 2, a producer whispered, giving him an encouraging nod. Jamal exhaled deeply, steeling himself for the moment ahead. He stepped onto the stage, met with thunderous applause. But as he settled into the guest chair, his gaze locked onto a familiar face already seated on stage, Shaq, towering even while sitting down, smiling reassuringly. "Jamal," the host began warmly, "tell us what went through your mind during this shocking incident." Jamal hesitated for only a brief moment, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, anger. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever faced that kind of disrespect. I was tired, exhausted from saving lives, and in a single moment, someone tried to strip all that away." The crowd murmured in support, clearly moved. The host turned toward Shaq, eyes bright with curiosity. "Shaq, you witnessed everything. What's your perspective on Officer Daniels' behavior?" Shaq leaned forward, eyes serious, his deep voice resonating through the studio. "People like Daniels, they hide behind power, behind authority. They think they're untouchable. But guess what? They're not." Cheers erupted, the audience energized by Shaq's words. Daniels, meanwhile, sat alone in his dim apartment, watching the interview unfold on his TV screen. His fists clenched, anger and despair mixing dangerously within him. "Officer Daniels claims he was just joking," the host continued, turning back to Jamal. "What do you say to that?" Jamal looked directly into the camera, speaking clearly and confidently. "It's not a joke when lives are on the line. It's not a joke when trust is broken. And it's certainly not a joke when it's someone's daily reality." The applause was deafening. Daniel's anger boiled over, and he hurled the remote against the wall, watching it shatter. He was isolated, defeated, and stripped of everything he had relied on. The host leaned toward Shaq one last time. "Any final thoughts?" Shaq's expression hardened as he leaned into the mic. "This ain't just about one guy," he declared firmly. "This is about change." Daniels felt chills run down his spine. Those words echoed in his ears, haunting him. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Shaq leaned forward at the polished mahogany conference table in the mayor's office, his eyes firm, his voice calm but powerful. "Look, justice for Jamal is important, but it's not enough. We can't just put a bandage over this. We need to fix the wound." The mayor, a seasoned politician named Elizabeth Warren, adjusted her glasses nervously. Beside her sat the police chief and several city council members, all tense, knowing this meeting would reshape the city's future. "Mr. O'Neill," the mayor began cautiously, "we understand your frustration, but systemic change takes time." Shaq shook his head slowly, his calm intensity filling the room. "You say it takes time, but people like Jamal don't have that luxury. Lives and reputations are being destroyed now." A councilman cleared his throat. "We acknowledge the problem, but realistically, what's your proposal?" Shaq locked eyes with each official around the table, ensuring they felt the weight of his next words. "Mandatory racial bias training for every officer in this city. Period. No exceptions. If someone carries a badge, they need to carry accountability too." The police chief shifted uncomfortably. "You're implying my department is fundamentally flawed." Shaq leaned closer, his presence commanding silence. "I'm not implying. I'm stating a fact. Officer Daniels isn't a lone wolf. He's a symptom of a bigger disease. You either cure it or it spreads." A heavy silence hung in the room. The mayor exchanged uneasy glances with her colleagues before finally nodding. "We'll implement it immediately," she said firmly. "Full transparency, public oversight, and rigorous accountability." Outside City Hall, a sea of reporters waited anxiously, cameras and microphones poised for the official announcement. Shaq emerged from the massive oak doors, his towering figure bathed in flashes of camera lights. Jamal stood next to him, humble yet proud, in his firefighter's uniform. The mayor stepped forward to the podium, her voice strong and resolute. Today, we commit to real change. Effective immediately, the city will enforce mandatory racial bias training for all police officers, and we will hold each of them accountable to the highest standards. Reporters immediately shouted questions, jostling for attention. "What about Officer Daniels?" one reporter called. The mayor's face hardened. "Officer Daniels has been officially terminated from his position. He will receive no pension, no severance, and no special protection. We are taking a clear stand. Racism has no place in our city." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniels, watching the live broadcast on his cracked TV screen, felt his knees buckle beneath him. Everything he'd built had crumbled to dust, and now there was nothing left. No badge, no career, no future. Back at City Hall, Shaq placed a supportive hand on Jamal's shoulder. "How you feeling?" he asked quietly. Jamal took a deep breath, gratitude clear in his eyes. "Honestly, for the first time, hopeful." Shaq smiled faintly. "Good. Keep that feeling. There's still work ahead." As the crowd began to disperse, Shaq noticed a young boy staring up at him, holding tightly onto his mother's hand. The boy stepped forward shyly. "Mr. Shaq, I want to be like you when I grow up." Shaq knelt down, meeting the child's eyes directly. "No, little man. Be better. Make sure you keep fighting, so someday you won't have to." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding more than his years should have allowed. Rising again, Shaq looked around at the city he was determined to change. He adjusted his jacket and turned toward the waiting media, his voice ringing out confidently. "Officer Daniels is one down, but make no mistake, there are more, and I won't rest until they're all exposed." Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing his determined expression. Reporters surged forward, shouting follow-up questions, but Shaq simply turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned crowd, a humbled city, and a powerful message. As he moved through the crowd, Jamal at his side, Shaq's words echoed loudly, reverberating through every news outlet in the nation. One down, more to go. The mighty cop who thought he was untouchable now sat in a dimly lit diner, filling out yet another application. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he wrote down his name, glancing around nervously to see if anyone recognized him. The scent of burnt coffee and greasy fries hung heavily in the air, a stark contrast to the high-end restaurants he once frequented without a second thought. He approached the counter cautiously, handing the manager the worn piece of paper. "Hey, man," Daniels forced a weak smile. "Just wanted to see if you guys had any security jobs open." The manager, a stern-faced man in his late 50s, took one look at the application and frowned deeply. His gaze lifted slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Wait, you're that cop, aren't you?" Daniels felt his throat tighten, but he tried to stay calm. "Look, that was a misunderstanding. The media twisted everything." The manager shook his head firmly, cutting him off. "Nah, we don't hire people like you." He handed the application back, like it was contaminated. "Sorry, can't have the bad press." Humiliation burned through Daniels as he snatched back the paper and quickly left, shoulders hunched. Outside, he shoved his hands deep into his pockets and moved briskly down the street, keeping his head down. But whispers followed him wherever he went, quiet, condemning voices that he couldn't escape. "That's him, the one Shaq took down," murmured a teenager as Daniels passed by. He ducked into an alley, desperate to disappear from the prying eyes. Leaning against the cold brick wall, Daniels took deep, shaky breaths, panic tightening his chest. He'd lost his badge, his pension, his friends, everything he had ever built. Pulling out his battered phone, he scrolled aimlessly, hoping to find some distraction, anything to numb the shame. Instead, a notification popped up. Heroic firefighter Jamal Harris honored with National Award. Daniel's heart plummeted as he clicked on the link, a grim curiosity taking over. On his cracked screen, Jamal stood proudly at a grand ceremony, his uniform impeccable, a medal gleaming on his chest. Cameras flashed around him, applause ringing out as the mayor shook his hand. And there beside Jamal stood Shaq, his arm around the firefighter, smiling broadly with genuine pride. The crowd cheered as Jamal leaned into the microphone, humility and strength in his voice. "I was just doing my job, but I hope this moment inspires real change." Daniels clenched his jaw, anger mixing with envy. That should have been him, admired, respected. Instead, he was a shadow, forgotten and discarded. The screen went dark as the battery finally died, leaving Daniels alone in the silence of his failure. He looked up at the sky, realizing for the first time that his life had truly unraveled beyond repair. As the evening grew colder, Daniel sunk deeper into despair. His legacy was now permanently tied to humiliation, and the hero he mocked had risen far above him. And there, in the bitter darkness, Daniels was forced to watch as Jamal became the hero he could never be. Shaq leaned back in his plush leather chair, the city lights glowing through the large windows behind him. He stared thoughtfully at his phone screen, fingertips hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, he reflected on the chaotic events of the past few weeks, how one simple encounter at a gas station had unraveled an entire system of injustice. Finally, he typed slowly, each word deliberate and powerful. A firefighter risks his life for strangers. A cop mocks him. That's why we fight for justice. He took a deep breath, his finger hovering briefly before tapping tweet. Within seconds, notifications began flooding in. Likes, shares, comments, a digital tidal wave. Across town, Jamal sat quietly in his apartment, scrolling through his own phone, eyes widening as Shaq's tweet instantly began trending. Messages poured in from friends, family, even strangers, all expressing solidarity and pride. He felt a rush of gratitude, but beneath that gratitude was something deeper: validation. The exhaustion, the humiliation he'd felt that day, it was finally overshadowed by overwhelming support. Man, Jamal whispered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Shaq really took it all the way. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the city, Daniel sat alone in a dimly lit motel room, staring blankly at the old television set flickering quietly in the corner. The screen displayed news anchors excitedly discussing Shaq's tweet, dissecting its impact, predicting changes in law enforcement, and praising Jamal as a national hero. Daniel's chest tightened with each passing second. His phone had long been silent, his world reduced to the echo of his own failures. His arrogance, his cruelty, everything he had wielded as power was now the very thing that condemned him to solitude. Back at Shaq's penthouse, the phone continued buzzing incessantly. The tweet had exploded. Millions of likes within minutes. Celebrities and politicians retweeted, sharing their own thoughts, stories, and demands for reform. Shaq scrolled through the comments, eyes narrowing in determination as he saw countless people sharing their own experiences of injustice, encouraged by his voice to finally speak up. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was Jamal. Shaq smiled, answering instantly. "Hey, Jamal, you seeing all this?" Jamal's voice was a mix of awe and quiet gratitude. "Shaq, I don't even know what to say. I never expected this." Shaq chuckled softly. "You don't gotta say anything, man. You stood strong. You're the real hero here." Jamal hesitated, his voice lowering, almost unsure. "You really think this will change anything?" Shaq leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. "One step at a time, but every step counts, man. Today was your step. Tomorrow it'll be someone else's." A comfortable silence hung between them, each man understanding the weight of the moment. Finally, Jamal broke it gently. "Thank you, Shaq." "No, Jamal. Thank you." After hanging up, Shaq glanced again at the buzzing phone, its screen lighting up with notifications faster than he could track. He stood and approached the window, looking out across the glittering city, feeling an immense sense of responsibility and possibility. Millions were listening, millions were watching, and now millions were joining the fight. He knew this tweet was only the beginning, a small flame lighting the way to greater change. As the night sky stretched endlessly above, Shaq's phone flashed again, 15 million likes and counting. He smiled softly to himself, murmuring quietly into the vast silence of his penthouse. "We're just getting started."